Today, some action autofocus settings updates for Z8 and Z9 shooters, some thoughts I've had in the wake of my Costa Rica workshop and during the Costa Rica workshop that just changed my mind about how I'm setting my camera up for action, wildlife, birds in flight, and I will share those thoughts with you, show you how they work in practice, announce two quick little setup videos to show how the settings have changed in the menu structure, and I'm also going to offer my settings files for both of those cameras for those of you who want to download them. Hey everyone, this one obviously is for the Nikon faithful, and we're going to talk a fair bit about the Z8 and the Z9's autofocus system. It mainly is about Z8, Z9, but those of you shooting older cameras or different cameras might want to keep tuned to it because I believe that the newer bodies coming out are going to share a lot of autofocus attributes with the Z8 and the Z9. So while I was in Costa Rica, we were encountering some of the most complex focusing situations on the planet, and we had a lot of amazing photographers along. And I always say that on these workshop trips, we all learn from each other. And also we had an amazing wildlife photographer and local guide in Dennis Valverde. If you haven't seen my video introducing Dennis and how amazing the whole Costa Rica trip was, you can click right here and check that out. I'll be running workshops with Dennis in Costa Rica as far out as I can imagine. I just love working with him. And he contributed some to this autofocus settings change too, and I'll tell you where that comes into play. We'll look through some images that I captured in Costa Rica of different situations, birds in flight versus reptiles versus birds in the water versus subject whose eyes don't quite work well with this auto subject detection system. And I'll share with you some things that I figured out through the course of day after day after day of firing thousands of frames at people, birds, and animals in these deep, complicated jungle situations. Some ways that I've come up with to just, with a single button press, flip which mode you're working with to best suit the particular situation. And like I said, we'll look through some images and I'll do a little demonstration. I know I'm going to do this for both the Z8 and the Z9, and I'm sharing my settings files for both of these cameras for the first time, just because I realized in Costa Rica that a lot of people get so sideways with the bank systems and how there's no real fixed reference point, that having a saved file with settings the way you want to start out with is just crucial. And so I'm going to just share them, and I expect that these are based off of my Bank A long detailed settings videos. I expect that you will tweak these to suit your taste. Not everybody should be shooting exactly the way I am and have exactly the preferences that I have. If you wonder why some setting is the way it is, if you look through those settings videos, here's a link to the one for the Z9. The Bank A video goes through the whole menu structure, start to finish. It's a long video, and I set up the basic structure. Then just the tweaks for B, C, and D are linked off of that video. Same thing for the Z8. Here's that settings video right here. All these videos are also linked in this video's full description if you click the title or show more. And today, I'll also be launching two very quick updates. June 2024 settings updates for autofocus. And there's a few other little tweaks where I do some nuanced changes to each of the banks that make more sense, for Milky Way shooting or for landscape shooting or for knockaround shooting. Let's just talk about what has changed a little bit. And the two biggest revelations that I had in Costa Rica are that auto area autofocus works extremely well for birds in flight. Particularly birds in flight where you have a little separation between the birds and the background and it's not a busy, complex background that the birds get lost in. There's going to be times where you want it and times where you don't want it, but mapping that to a button for quick access no matter what mode you're in is really beneficial. So we'll talk about how to do that. The other thing that was revelatory to me was for those situations where you have a subject who is not being recognized correctly, or the camera's grabbing something other than your subject, a leaf instead of the bird's eye, or the moth's wing instead of its head. I have in the past advocated using single point autofocus or a small dynamic autofocus area point to sort of turn off subject detection completely and use a dumb point that you have to actually hold on the subject to stay focused. Well, Dennis Valverde had the coolest idea, which is instead of going to single point autofocus or dynamic area autofocus, use recall shooting functions hold to activate, press the button and it'll flip from your main autofocus mode into 3D with subject detection turned off. That way, you can lock anything in your scene that's an identifiable focus point, and it'll track it all over the frame, and if an eye comes into the frame, it doesn't flip and try to jump to an eye or a false eye in certain situations. I'm gonna show you how I've organized that in the camera. I'm gonna use the Z8 to demonstrate, but the Z9 is identical, just slightly different button layout. You can watch those 2 setup videos that I linked earlier or that are down in this video's full description to see exactly how those layouts are structured as I run through the menus and put them together, along with some other enhancements to the menu, short setup videos, and you can download my settings. But I'm gonna show you in camera how this works then and what buttons I'm pressing, and then we're gonna jump in and talk about some different images that showcase when these different situations arise and how you should think about using these different modes. All right, so I think whenever I'm showcasing how things may have changed a little bit regarding settings and autofocusing, it's better to just show you, what buttons I'm pressing on the camera, let you look through my viewfinder while I'm doing it. When I'm doing this exercise, I'll, through the magic of technology, put my viewfinder right up here so you can see through it while I'm working on it. And I've got a print of an owl that I photographed during our Charleston, South Carolina workshop, and the owl coming through the woods. And I'll just use that like it was a bird here in the room with me, just to kind of highlight some of what I'm talking about. Let me show you, looking through here, we're looking through the Z8 right now, but I'll talk through the controls, how I've changed them on the Z8 and the Z9, and then you can see that in those setup videos that I'm linking. You can see I'm in my custom settings bank, B for action. I'm in my shooting bank, B for action. I always go through either on the touch screen or with the D-pad on the back of the camera. I do that changing in the eye menu. And right now, I'm in wide area large. That's my standard action mode. That hasn't changed. And I was on animal, but I'm gonna flip to bird. And the minute that I do that, you see all of a sudden it's seeing the owl, boom, in the middle of that wide area. If I go off wide area, it loses it. It's only really looking in that wide area box. And that's really wonderful for picking up erratic, moving subjects. It's bigger than the 3D tracking box. The minute that I hold down my autofocus on button, it locks on that owl. And if I change to my lens function button, that hybrid handoff mode, it flips to 3D tracking that'll go all over the frame. Okay. Now the cool thing though with birds in flight and having just the ability to track birds and other animals that's so good now is that auto area does a fine job. Right now I just hit the auto area button and boom, there's not even, it gets rid of all boxes. It looks a lot like 3D and everything else, but you could actually, if there's a bird in flight, just hit that button and not worry about where in the frame the bird is. I didn't have to pick it up at all. And what I'm doing that with is the display button. That's right, the display button. Why the display button? Well, the display button is right next to the autofocus on button. And I'm doing that through AF on plus AF area mode, auto area. So if you're in bird detecting, you see a bird in flight, even if you've been photographing, some other animal or a bird that was more complicated, and you were using the 3D or the wide area with subject detection, and you can hand it off to hybrid, all of a sudden there's a bird in flight, boom, you just hit that display button, which is right next to the autofocus on button, and you're in auto area. Let me demonstrate it with my fluid head over here. I've got, even if I took my box off, it's looking for the closest interesting subject. Same thing with this light bulb up here. I don't have the box on it at all. I suddenly hit that display button and it's on auto area autofocus. It's looking for whatever the obvious subject in the frame might be. See how that works? Could be our bird. All right, just hitting the display button takes me automatically to auto area. I'm not directing it with a wide area box. I'm not directing it with a 3D area box. If I let off of it, I'm back in my base autofocus mode, which is wide area, and right now I'm in bird. Now, I can also, like we said, it still has the hybrid handoff to the lens function button. The lens function button is simply 3D. It's autofocus on plus 3D. So I've programmed my lens function button to be 3D area plus autofocus on, and I've programmed my display button to be auto area autofocus plus AF on. So as long as I hold it down, those two modes are going to hand off from the standard wide area. Now, what about a situation where what we really want is some subject that's not the bird's eyes, or maybe the camera is not picking up what I really want. It's going for the bird's feet for some reason, all right? Well, now I've got it programmed, like I said, where if I push the function 2 button on the Z8, that would be the function 3 button on the Z9. We've had our first change between the Z8 and the Z9. Z9 has 3 buttons. I put it down that bottom button, which I can reach from either the vertical or the horizontal hold. Suddenly I have just a straight up 3D point. I can move it around. I can center it with my joystick pushing the center button. And it's not looking for eyes. Have you noticed that? I've turned off subject detection completely, but it's still a 3D point. If I put it on the bird's eye and hold the button down, it's going to track it all over the frame. But if I put it on that specular highlight in the trees back there, it's also going to track that all over the frame. And the bird's face being in the frame, even though we're in bird detect right now, well, we're not in bird detect. We turned it off. You see it up there at the top of the frame. It shows AFC, 3D, and no subject detection option. It's not auto, it's not birds, it's not animals, it's no subject detection. It's whatever I tell the camera is important. It could be the printer behind the fluid head, even though the fluid head's closer. It's not getting fooled. It could be the wall behind the light bulb, that joint. Boom, well, it lost it. It's a little tricky, but you get the idea. I could say it's the socket and not the bulb itself. It's the bulb and not the socket. You get to direct it to whatever in the frame is of interest to you, but it tracks it all over the frame. As smart as these cameras and their sensors are, it makes a lot more sense to use this to me than single point autofocus, where you have to compose and move the point to where you want it in the frame. In this case, you can set it right in the center and then recompose and track the subject that you've picked up, as long as you're holding down the autofocus on button, right? We could also, still use our lens autofocus button, all right? It's going to be a dumb 3D point unless I hit that function 2 button again, function 3 on the Z9. Well, now I can hear people saying, that's all really well and good, but how are you changing your display modes now? You've put auto area autofocus on the display. Well, on the Z8, when we're in our action mode, I'm never going to be bracketing. So I've changed and put display on the bracketing button. So I can flip through my different chosen display modes just by pressing bracketing. And on the Z9, we have those buttons down at the bottom of the body, and I've put it on quality. So I can cycle through with the Z9 by pushing that quality button on the back of the camera. I just remapped that to display. There has never been a time in the last 1.5 years, 2 years that I have changed from RAW. So, quality is kind of a useless button to me. All right, so that's the main ways that I have changed the control structure. When it comes to changing banks or to changing subject detection modes, I use the eye menu. It's just the fastest way that I've been from people to animal to birds. Now, I've remapped my autofocus button on both cameras to be able to switch modes. So this is small area instead of wide area, or wide area large. This is wide area small. This is wide area large. It's just flipping between those two. Those are the only two base modes I might want to change. I might want a smaller box. If there's a whole bunch of subjects and they're smaller, the smaller box could help me dial in a smaller subject. I can move that box around in the frame, say I only want that bird. And then once it's locked, I can hand it off with my lens function button and travel all over the frame with 3D once it's locked. That's the hybrid handoff. It's got that owl's face. If I want it, if the owl's in flight moving fast, I can just use auto area and it's looking all over the frame for birds, all right? If I suddenly have monkeys in the trees, I'm gonna hit my eye menu, jump down here without even taking my eye out of the viewfinder, boom, I'm an animal. Now I'm in animal detect. And you'll notice, I'm gonna hit my autofocus button down on the body and switch into wide area. You'll notice it's not picking up the owl's face nearly as well or consistently in animal as it does in bird. That subject detection really does make a difference, and bird detection is crazy good. And I find that, if I'm shooting a hybrid of birds and animals when I was in Costa Rica, it was good to leave it on bird eye detect, just because if a bird pops up, it's so good at detecting birds, and it's still pretty decent with animals and bird detect. But then, if you find yourself just really focusing in on mammals and reptiles and things like that, it's probably better to jump into that animal eye detect. And once again, if you've got a subject that's really not working out, the camera's looking for something that's not your subject's eyes and it's getting frustrating to you, you just hit that recall shooting functions hold button. It's function 2 on the Z8. It's function 3 on the Z9 in my settings, and it suddenly goes to a dumb 3D tracking point that's not looking for any subject in particular, only what you tell it to track all over the frame. All right, I find all of that infinitely quicker to access and use than putting cycle autofocus area on a button. Even though I have done that on my autofocus button, because I find it so much better to do autofocus settings through the I menu. This lets me choose what my base one is from a limited number really quickly with that button down there to flip from wide area to small area. And I'll show you how to do that all in the settings videos, both for the Z8 and for the Z9, along with just some other tweaks for the different banks alongside action. All right, so let's jump in. Let's look at some photos back on my computer of when you would use these different autofocus methods for different types of subjects. And we're going to be focused mainly on wildlife, but it really does translate through to other kinds of action. All right, so here I got some examples from Costa Rica of some different situations where my standard wide area, large or small, handing off to hybrid, handoff 3D with subject detection works great, whereas maybe you want to go jump into auto area autofocus instead, versus when the subject detection tends to kind of fail and you might actually need to just put a dumb 3D tracking point with no subject detection. So let's jump in, let's look at these. I'm just gonna kind of go full screen and run through them. These are scenarios where, or actually we can see settings here. I'll open this up and you can see sort of histogram and some camera settings if you're interested. So, you don't necessarily need to see all this clutter. You can just look at the histogram and camera settings right here. Most of these are going to be with my 400 TC in Costa Rica. That's all from Costa Rica from last month. So, this is a scenario where the animal is large enough and frame filling enough. If you're an animal eye detect or even auto subject detection, auto area would nail the eyes of this capuchin monkey. It would nail this I think it's a trogon bird in the forest. It would nail this little coati in the tree, this little baby coati. And when you see a bird come ripping through your scene in flight and you've got enough separation between it and the background, auto area autofocus, especially if you're in bird detect, it's just gonna pick it up and you'll just be sort of blown away the way it'll track a bird right through your scene. It's mind-bendingly good. I think you get an idea from this caracara flying by our workshop that, the Z9 had no problem. And I can't remember the name of these birds off the top of my head. Somebody can maybe chime in the comments. They're just insanely cool. They're very fast, very erratic, very challenging to photograph. And auto area autofocus worked great with them. Again, here, this little bird was coming in and out of its nest and nailing, being able to just pick it up as small, as erratic, difficult to capture. Auto area autofocus, nailed it, boom, just picked it up. Another little bird flying around through bushes in this beautiful meadow. And even this situation where I was kind of lining up and using single point, I'd flipped into single point mode and was thinking about trying to think about doing a macro on this interesting looking bush, and I was just contemplating it when suddenly I saw this little insect flying through and I hit the auto area button on display and boom, locked it. Again, if you've got little creatures like this spider monkey baby, large in the frame, even if it's relatively complicated, auto area is probably going to do a good job. But the smaller it gets in the frame and the more complicated it gets, that's when you start wanting to have something like 3D, or if it's a fast-moving erratic subject, maybe the wide area, large or small, to isolate your subject and say, this is the one that I'm after. Otherwise, the camera starts hunting and seeking. This little crocodile out a distance away from me did not necessarily look like a subject to the camera, but by putting the wide area over it with its eye, boom, all of a sudden it locks that eye and I can hand it off to that 3D tracking mode with animal eye detect. These macaws, we were photographing them collecting dates from a tree and flying, and it was just a complicated, difficult background, and the camera was hunting and seeking and not doing a very good job in auto area autofocus mode. So having that base mode of wide area large where I could pick up the bird with bird detect eye detect, boom, I could say this is the bird of interest to me and track it as it flies through this complicated background. This is one where auto area was just failing me, and 3D or wide area handing off to 3D was the ticket for getting these images, which were really, really just wonderful. Again, this is another one where this woodpecker, kept coming out of its nest and going back into its nest, and I was wanting to capture it in flight, but the camera would start getting subject detection, in the auto area mode where it was picking up the holes and things instead of the bird. It's not big enough in the frame, and so running with wide area, and as it came out of the hole, boom, hitting that wide area with the 3D handoff to 3D tracking on the lens function button, boom, I was nailing pictures of it coming out of the nest. This toucan in this complicated background, auto area is not picking up even with it still. Using the wide area, picked up its eye. I was able to put the wide area around the bird, whether wide area large or wide area small, or put the 3D tracking on the bird, boom, nails its eye. Same thing here. Complicated background, difficult when it's not moving and you're tracking it with a simple background for auto area to work. I think auto area, those images that we had of the Caracara flying through the scene, this is where auto area is just going to be stellar for you. It's the exact setup. That's why you want it on the display button. This sort of thing starts to happen. Practice with it. Like anything else we're talking about, it's practice, practice, practice. These monkeys moving through the trees, no way this mama spider monkey and her baby were going to get picked up by auto area with all these leaves and things as they're swinging through the trees. The wide area with animal eye detect was nailing it. So this baby howler monkey, just a complicated background. Auto area, it might, but you're going to do better putting that box around the howler monkey baby's head and nailing the eyes. Such a cute little double. This is a situation, this one right here with this ibis wading through, going after prey, right near where we stay for our Costa Rica workshop, just a walk from the hotel room. You would think that it would pick up the ibis's eye, or that it would pick up the reflected ibis's eye. And occasionally it was bouncing around between those, but it was also grabbing reflections of leaves on the surface. Had this really difficult time. And so I hit that recall shooting functions hold button on my Z9, that's function 3. For those of you that are Z8 shooters, again, function 2, and boom, it throws me into 3D tracking with no subject detection, and then I just put it on the bird's eye. And that enabled me to get these really stellar moments and make sure that they were in focus the way that I wanted. Instead of focusing a leaf in the reflection of the background and missing a shot like this. Again, this lizard who was on a tree stump, it just wouldn't lock its eye. It was going after claws, it was going after bits of wood. Putting it in the 3D with no subject detection with recall shooting functions hold, boom, set it on the eye, lock the eye. Perfect, even as it moved. Same thing with this crocodile. For some reason, even this close up, it wanted to go for different pieces of the crocodile's head instead of the crocodile's eye. Maybe it's the fact that the crocodile's eye is just so similar to the rest of its body. It was real hit or miss over whether the subject detection in animal mode was capturing this croc's eye, and this was an important shot to me. So, whoop, touch that recall shooting functions hold button on my Z9, function 3, whoop, lock the eye with 3D detect, nails it, tracks it, keeps it steady and in the frame. Same thing with this smaller croc with the reflections, just didn't work well getting eye detection, but using the 3D mode, I didn't even have to worry about where I'm putting my point. I kept it in the center, locked the eye, and then composed how I wanted. So those are situations and scenarios where I think you're just going to do better with these settings, you know, versus other settings. So some good examples, hopefully those illustrate when you want to use these different area modes and autofocus settings. All right, so there you go. You know, I think you can see why this really works out well for me. Now, I can foresee a few questions from people. You know, have my settings changed for the Z6, Z7, Z6 II, Z7 II, Z50, ZFC, those older cameras that don't have the 3D autofocus? And the answer is no. You know, I've advocated for a long time, and I showcased that in Costa Rica to the people shooting with those cameras, that you're just best off using auto area autofocus with subject detection override. And I did a video recently about that, or subject tracking override. I did a video not long ago, early last summer, where I showcased the best ways to use those cameras, and you can hit that link right here, shot on Selby Island. And that all still holds true. I haven't had any change about that. The people with the ZF are going to ask, have my settings changed for that? And I would say not necessarily, because this camera doesn't have banks and user modes. I still use some of these ideas in principle with this camera, but it's not my choice for action scenarios, wildlife. You know, it could be a backup camera, but you really have to go into the menus, go into the I menu, go into the My menu, and change these things physically. And there aren't enough custom buttons to really set it up as an action camera in the same way. This is much more my deliberative travel landscape camera and manual focus lens camera. It's a passion camera for me. The Z8, the Z9, those are going to be your main action autofocus cameras. I'm sure that the upcoming Z6 updates and Z7 updates, probably called the 3s, will have a lot of this same technology, and we'll be talking about that when those release. I know a lot of people are going to ask about, you know, why aren't you talking about the ability to cycle autofocus area on a button? For me, that is much more cumbersome than the system I just showed you. You know, I have to press the button multiple times to get what I want, instead of just being able to flip with a quick press to whatever I want. Now, that being said, I have remapped the autofocus button on the Z8 and the Z9, the one down on the side that's kind of awkward, you have to pull your hand back to change my main autofocus mode between a limited number of potential autofocus scenarios. And they differ, but whether I'm in the landscape or in astro, in my standard knock-around mode, or in action shooting, and it lets me eliminate a lot of options, but flip through some different ones. And that's going to be showcased in those setup videos that are linked from this video. The other question is, you know, where are the setup files that you've promised, the settings files? And I'm attaching those to those setup videos. I'd like you to understand the settings. I'm hoping that you'll watch those setup videos to get a quick tutorial on why the settings have changed the way they are. Those videos aren't very long. The settings files are linked within them. So, all right, everybody, I appreciate your taking the time watching. I hope, you know, that these settings work as well for you as they did for me. It's the best setup I could come up with for myself, and it worked really well for me in Costa Rica. You know, over the first half of my trip, I was kind of tweaking and playing with things on the Z9, and then I was helping other people in the workshop, flipping my settings card file around with them, letting them download what I was doing, and then I started tweaking other people's Z8s, and I came up with this system, and it worked really well. I think everyone was enjoying it. So I hope you will too. We've got an office hours session June 18th. That's coming up fast. It's an open Q&A. We'll take some of the questions that we had when we did our big Lightroom CC versus Lightroom Classic discussion. We had a lot of great questions submitted, but feel free to ask any other questions, including about this stuff. I'm sure there will be a lot of Nikon questions. And Rick and I and Darren will be taking, hopefully David can join us, we'll be taking those questions over the full hour, 10 a.m. Pacific. You can sign up for that at hudsonhenry.com/office hours, or you can hit this link right here. It's always fun, big group get together. So leave your question there, sign up for YouTube or Zoom. If you're on Zoom, we can all see each other. I love to have a big full Zoom meeting. All right. So, it's a little bit rainy weather here in my hometown of Portland, Oregon, but nice weather is on the horizon. My daughter's birthday is coming up. We're going camping. It's a nice little lull in the action here. Lots of fun new stuff to talk about in the photography world, some lenses, some other fun stuff. So, you know, we'll be talking more. I hope you're all out there staying creative, enjoying some nice weather and family time yourselves, staying safe. And we'll see you next week.